Rain fell like spent artillery shells across the North African desert, turning the sand into a muddy graveyard where the remnants of the British Eighth Army struggled through their third day of retreat. Among them moved men who only weeks earlier had fought with quiet determination, now sunburned, dehydrated and exhausted from nights without water. Their breaths came in ragged gasps. Behind them marched a contingent of German officers, uniforms pristine despite the conditions, eyes cold, with a superiority forged by years of blitzkrieg victories and conquered territories. They walked not with caution, but with the certainty of men who believed the war had proven everything worth knowing about their enemy. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive. So do me one favour, tap like so this story isn't buried, show support by subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video so more people discover the truth history tried to hide. General Klaus Hoffmann, a lean, precise man with iron-grey hair cropped close to his skull, watched the British with a mixture of contempt and amusement. "So these," he muttered to Major Ernst Vogel beside him, "are the defenders of the British Empire." Vogel smirked, adjusting the collar of his Afrika Korps tunic. "An empire built on tea and politeness, not soldiers." The officers chuckled, their laughter swallowed by the oppressive desert heat. The British heard every word, though none responded. Private Thomas Bennett, once muscular but now gaunt, kept his eyes fixed on the sand-swept horizon. Sergeant William Hughes stumbled ahead of him, his boots held together by wire and determination. Days of fighting, capture, and scorching sun had reduced once strong frames to skeletal outlines of themselves. To the Germans, it confirmed their belief. British strength was nothing more than colonial posturing, a myth carried by naval power, not men. But there was something the officers failed to recognise. These exhausted, stumbling soldiers were not representative of Great Britain. They were the survivors of a desert campaign stretched beyond breaking point, smashed by Rommel's tactical brilliance and supply line failures. Many had not drunk properly in days. Their reinforcements had evaporated under the chaos of rapid German advances. Heat and thirst had clawed at them harder than enemy fire. To judge a nation by its most depleted moment was a mistake born of arrogance. Still, that arrogance deepened with every mile. "Look at that one," Hoffmann remarked, pointing at Corporal Davies, who had dropped to both knees. "1 week under African sun, and they collapse." Vogel laughed. "If these are their finest, imagine the shopkeepers who raised them." Even some of the younger German soldiers snickered, emboldened by the presence of their superiors. Captain Friedrich Weber, the only one among the officers who remained quiet, studied the British more carefully. He noticed the way Sergeant Hughes kept pulling Bennett forward over patches of loose sand, never letting him fall. He saw Davies force himself back up, despite the trembling in his legs. These are not weak men, Weber thought. They were simply broken men. Still, Weber remained silent. The air was already thick with the mockery of his fellow officers. The column halted near the ruins of an Italian supply depot. The British collapsed onto the scorched ground, pulling their tattered shirts over their heads for shade. Hoffmann walked among them, hands clasped behind his back, surveying them like livestock awaiting slaughter. "The Führer was right," he said loudly. "Britain fights with ships and diplomacy, not bodies." Thomas Bennett looked up for the first time. His lips were cracked, his face hollow, but something harder than the desert sun flashed in his eyes. He didn't speak. He knew words would cost him moisture he couldn't waste, but the stare lingered long enough for Hoffmann to frown. Weber noticed. "Sir," he said quietly, "they have marched far in this heat." "Perhaps their condition is understandable." Hoffmann waved him off. "Excuses. If this is the best their island produces, our conquest would have been assured had they all been like them." The irony, had he known it, was staggering. The strongest British soldiers, the towering Grenadier Guards, the well-fed Home Guard units, the men built like oak from Highland labour, were thousands of miles away, preparing to receive prisoners like him. But the officers could not imagine such a thing. Their world was small, this desert, this march, these beaten figures. And so their arrogance grew like sand accumulating in a storm, shifting, unstable, and destined to bury them. As the march resumed, Bennett whispered to Hughes, "They think we're all like this." Hughes managed a faint, bitter smile. "Let them. Better their shock later." Hoffman overheard the tone, but not the words. To him, the exchange was confirmation of British stubbornness masquerading as courage. "Even now they mumble," he said to Vogel. "Arrogance truly is the British disease." Vogel laughed again, but the mockery was beginning to wear thin. The heat was penetrating even German uniforms now, and the officers' commentary grew quieter as the sun stole their breath. Hours later, the prisoners were herded into canvas-covered trucks, waiting near a makeshift airfield. The Germans observed, still amused, as the British struggled up the tailgates. "Imagine," Vogel said, "if they ever saw real German soldiers, they would surrender before raising rifles." Bennett heard that too. He didn't look back, but a quiet thought burned through him. "You haven't met the real British men either." Weber, lingering near the convoy, felt a strange unease settle in his stomach. An intuition that the officers' confidence was hanging on a thread they couldn't see. The British were weak now. Yes, but weakness was not their nature. It was a moment, not a measure. The trucks lurched forward, engines grinding against desert winds. The officers gathered in a staff car, drinking lukewarm water and congratulating themselves on their victory over such unimpressive foes. Their voices blended with the rumble of engines, swollen with confidence that the war, even as new fronts opened, still proved their superiority over the men they mocked. They believed they understood the enemy. Certain these dehydrated silhouettes represented a nation. But beyond the channel, they did not yet know they would cross, waited a reality that would break every assumption. When they finally met the British guarding those distant camps, their laughter would vanish into silence. The port at Toulon smelled of brine, diesel, and the acrid tang of burned metal, a scent that clung to every surface like a reminder of what the war had done to France. German officers stepped out of the transport train stiffly, their boots hitting the cobblestones with a confidence that had not diminished since the march through Africa. General Hoffman surveyed the harbour with the same superiority he carried everywhere, as if the very Mediterranean owed him acknowledgement. The British stood nearby, rifles held with casual precision, watching the prisoners with a calm that irritated him more than open hostility would have. Their silence felt like a judgment. Their discipline felt like a statement. Major Vogel nudged Hoffman. "Look at them, still pretending to be professional soldiers." His tone held an easy smirk. "If they had fought like this at Dunkirk, perhaps they would have lasted longer." Hoffman nodded, though his eyes narrowed. The British Guards did not look like the ragged prisoners he had marched across Libya. They were solid, square-shouldered, and quietly alert, but he dismissed the observation before it could settle. Surely these were exceptions, colonial troops perhaps, not representatives. The prisoners were herded onto the gangway. Metal groaned beneath their boots as they boarded the transport ship. Inside, the air was cool enough to sting after weeks of desert heat. The British running the ship moved with efficient precision. Their instructions clipped, calm, and practiced. Even their exhaustion looked disciplined. Weber, walking with a line of officers, noticed how easily they maneuvered heavy equipment, how casually they secured cargo nets. It unsettled him in ways he could not name. "This is what island isolation buys," Vogel muttered. "Muscle without hardship, strength without testing." Weber said nothing. He watched a British MP, a man with shoulders like a ship's bulkhead, reposition a fuel drum as if it weighed little more than a canteen. Perhaps isolation was not the only path to preservation. Below deck, the officers were assigned a separate compartment. Metal bunks were bolted to the walls, and a single electric lamp hummed overhead. It was simple, but unexpectedly clean. Hoffman looked around with mild irritation. They treat us like guests, he scoffed. As if courtesy could erase defeat. It is not courtesy, Vogel said. It is superiority. They want us to see how civilized they believe themselves to be. Weber sat on the edge of a bunk, feeling the subtle sway of the ship. He remembered the gaunt British prisoners struggling against heat and thirst. He remembered the British Guards on the dock. Broad, disciplined, almost indifferent. Two images that did not align. Something did not fit, and the inconsistency gnawed at him. The ship rumbled to life, vibrating through the metal frame. As they pulled away from the occupied French coastline, the officers fell quiet. Europe shrank behind them like a memory being rewritten. In its place rose the unsettling question of what waited across the channel. Days passed, measured by the rhythm of the sea and the monotony of confinement. The officers took scheduled walks on the deck under guard supervision. The British MPs rotated shifts seamlessly, each group as tall and stone-faced as the last. Their presence was a wordless reminder that the Germans were no longer masters of their fate. Hoffmann tried to ignore them, but he could not forget the sight of a guard effortlessly hoisting a jammed loading hatch that two German soldiers had struggled with earlier. Mechanical advantage, he muttered to himself, though he knew it wasn't. These men were simply larger, stronger, and disturbingly unbothered by the physical demands of their work. At dinner, served in metal trays that steamed in the cool air, the officers sampled rations that startled them. Beef, potatoes, bread, cheese. Nothing luxurious, but far richer than the ersatz coffee and black bread they were used to. Vogel snorted at the sight of it. They will feed us like livestock, so they can boast about their generosity. The British guard distributing the trays said nothing, but his expression flickered just for a moment, as if the comment confirmed something about the Germans he had always suspected. Weber caught the look. It was not hatred, it was disappointment. That night, the sea grew rougher, and the officers lay awake in the dim compartment as the ship ploughed through choppy water. Weber stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of engines and the thud of boots above. He couldn't shake a single intrusive thought. If the men guarding us are this strong, what are the soldiers we have not yet seen? The ones who were never exhausted, never starving, never retreating. A storm rolled in during the fourth night. The ship pitched violently, and the Germans clung to their bunks, teeth gritted against the nausea. Above deck, the British continued their shifts unfazed, moving through sheets of rain with practiced ease. The German officers watched from a sheltered corner as two MPs secured loose cargo in the wind, their bodies braced with a stability that seemed impossible. Hoffmann felt something stir in him, a thin crack in the polished armour of his certainty. It irritated him deeply. "Brute strength," he said coldly, as if saying it made it true. "That's all." But the words didn't land with conviction, not like they once did. Weber studied the storm-lit faces of the MPs. They were young but not soft, muscular but not clumsy. Their movements carried a quiet authority that came from training, yes, but also from a nation that had resources, food, and time. Luxuries. Germany no longer possessed. The storm passed by morning, leaving the sea eerily calm. The officers returned below, but an unspoken shift had taken place among them. Even Vogel, usually so quick with mockery, remained silent as he wiped seawater from his coat. The British weren't the enemy he had imagined, and that realization left a strange, unwelcome heaviness in the room. On the seventh day, the ship announced its approach to the British coastline with a distant horn. The officers felt the change immediately. The sea's rhythm altered. The air tasted different. Hope, anxiety, resentment, and curiosity all twisted together in their chests. Hoffmann stood on the deck as the first outline of land emerged through the early morning mist. "So, this is Great Britain," he murmured. He tried to sound dismissive, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Because on the docks waiting for them, visible even from afar, stood a line of British military police unlike any they had seen before. Tall, broad, unmoving. Their silhouettes looked almost carved into the landscape, like monuments rather than men. Vogel swallowed hard. Are they all built like that? Weber didn't answer. He only stared, the uneasy intuition he had carried since Africa crystallizing into something cold and undeniable. The Germans had mocked British men before capture. But now, as the ship drew closer, it became clear that the real shock, the one that would rewrite everything they believed, was only just beginning. The gangway thudded against the dock, and the German officers stepped into a world that felt impossibly ancient, yet utterly vital. The British sky stretched grey and eternal, a vast canvas that dwarfed the officers before they even met a single guard. But when the military police approached, their size made the sky seem almost modest by comparison. These men, broad-shouldered, tall as church doors, solid as Yorkshire stone, walked with a deliberate calm that made the Germans feel suddenly weightless. General Hoffmann stiffened, trying to reclaim the dignity he carried across Europe, but the sight of a guard whose chest looked like a castle wall momentarily stole his breath. Major Vogel's confident smirk faltered. Even Weber, normally unreadable, felt something inside him tilt. The largest of the MPs, a man with a jaw carved like Cornish granite, lifted a cargo crate from the dock with one hand, a single hand. The crate looked heavy enough to require 2 men, yet he moved it as casually as someone adjusting a teacup. Vogel blinked, uncertain whether he had witnessed strength or sorcery. "They breed them differently here," he whispered. Hoffmann didn't respond. His silence said enough. The officers had expected civilization, order, maybe even British Reserve. They had not expected giants. The prisoners were marched toward a line of trucks. Even the vehicles looked oversized, engines rumbling with a kind of abundance Germany hadn't known in years. As the Germans climbed aboard, the MPs scanned them with a watchful patience that felt more intimidating than a shouted command. Weber caught the gaze of one guard, a young man with steady eyes and arms like coiled cables. There was no mockery in his expression, no triumph. Only a calm, confident scrutiny, as if measuring not their rank, but their character. Weber looked away first. The drive inland carried them past endless green fields, stone villages, and towns untouched by bomb craters. Britain, even in wartime, radiated a strange permanence, an unshaken confidence that Europe had lost beneath rubble. Vogel tried to reclaim his earlier arrogance, pointing at a passing farmhouse. "Simple land, simple people," he murmured. But the attempt sounded hollow. Every British citizen they passed looked healthier than soldiers on the Eastern Front, healthier even than many officers in Berlin. The Germans began to understand something they had mocked before capture. Geography, resources, and the Channel had protected this nation from the war's hunger, and that protection had consequences, visible, towering consequences. By the time they reached the POW camp, the sun had broken through the clouds, painting the stone walls in pale gold. Camp 18, Featherstone Park in Northumberland, loomed with a scale none of the officers expected. Guard towers rose high, manned by yet more imposing MPs, whose silhouettes looked almost unreal in the afternoon light. As the gates opened, Hoffmann experienced an unfamiliar sensation. He felt small, truly, unmistakably small. The prisoners were lined up for processing, and even the administrative building seemed designed for men of greater stature. Desks, doorways, benches, everything had dimensions hinting at a population larger than the one they came from. Inside the intake hall, the MPs directed the officers with curt efficiency. Fingerprints, photographs, basic medical checks, each step executed with a rhythm that suggested deep preparation. One guard took Vogel's coat and hung it without strain, though the heavy wool always felt cumbersome to Vogel himself. Another measured Hoffmann's height against a notched board on the wall. 5'9", the guard said, jotting it down. Hoffmann straightened his posture instinctively. The guard, 6'5" at least, didn't seem to notice. Or worse, didn't need to. As evening settled, the officers were assigned barracks separate from enlisted POWs. The building was warm, the bunks sturdy, and the air held a faint scent of coal smoke and pine. Hoffman refused to admit it, but the comfort unsettled him more than discomfort would have. He sat stiffly on the mattress, watching an MP through the window carrying a water barrel across the yard as if it were filled with air instead of liquid. "This is absurd," Vogel muttered. "Strength without struggle is unnatural." Weber, sitting on the lower bunk, replied quietly, "Perhaps it is simply another kind of struggle, one we have never understood." Over the next days, the officers observed a routine that challenged every belief they had carried about British soldiers. Morning drills took place outside their barracks windows, where MPs ran laps with sandbags slung over their shoulders, their steps steady and unhurried. They practiced holds, takedowns, and maneuvers that combined brute power with surprising precision. Even the simplest actions, a guard tossing a coal sack, another adjusting a steel gate, carried the effortless strength of men accustomed to physical labour from childhood. The Germans whispered among themselves, trying to reconcile propaganda with reality. One afternoon, while being escorted to the camp library, Vogel paused near the yard fence. Two MPs were unloading supply crates from a lorry, stacking them with mechanical ease. "They're like draft horses," Vogel muttered. Hoffman shot him a stern look. "Draft horses don't read Shakespeare," he said dryly, nodding toward another MP reclining against a post with a book tucked under his arm. The contradiction unsettled them both. Strength they could dismiss. Intelligence they could contest. But a combination of both forced them to reconsider everything. Weber alone seemed willing to acknowledge the truth. Watching the MPs train, he felt something heavy settle into his mind. Not fear exactly, but respect tinged with regret. These men were not the caricatures shown in German propaganda films. They were not soft. They were not weak. They were something far more dangerous, capable, and they had been underestimated. On the fifth evening, a Northumberland sunset spread amber across the yard as an MP called the officers out for roll. The same giant from the dock, the one who'd lifted the crate with a single hand, stood before them, his shadow long against the gravel. His presence alone silenced the group. He glanced at the roster, then back at the officers, his voice deep but even. "You'll be moved to work detail tomorrow," he said. "Light duty, but regular hours. You'll need your rest." The words were routine, but to the officers, they felt like a verdict. Not punishment, reality. A reality where the men guarding them were not the weaklings they had mocked, but living proof of a strength Germany had failed to anticipate. As the MP turned to leave, Hoffman's gaze lingered on him with something between awe and disbelief. For the first time he understood that the humiliation had only begun. Not through violence, but through the quiet, unshakable contrast of power. And at dawn, when the officers reported for their first work assignment, they would discover something that would shake their remaining certainty far more than muscle ever could. Morning in the Northumberland camp began with a silence broken only by the creak of wooden beams and the shuffle of boots on wet gravel. The sun rose slowly, brushing the barracks with a soft grey that made the wire fences glow rather than menace. General Hoffman stepped outside with the other officers, bracing himself for the unknown rhythm of their assigned work. The air smelled of coal smoke, damp earth, and distant heather. A scent so far removed from the war-torn landscapes of Europe that it unsettled him more than barbed wire ever could. The officers were escorted to a storage yard where long rows of crates, barrels and tools waited to be sorted. It looked simple enough, mundane labour that required little more than endurance. Major Vogel smirked faintly, relieved by the familiarity of physical tasks. "At least they haven't asked us to dig tunnels," he whispered. But the comfort died as soon as their supervising MP stepped into view. It was the same massive guard from the docks, his expression neutral, his posture impossibly steady. He handed out the work assignments without raising his voice, his authority quiet yet absolute. Weber received the lightest task, inventorying tools. Vogel and Hoffman were assigned to move crates weighing far more than they anticipated. As Hoffman bent to lift the first one, his shoulders trembled under the load. Vogel tried to assist, only to find that the combined effort barely budged it. The MP watched for a moment, then stepped forward and lifted the crate alone, his movement smooth, almost effortless. He set it down a short distance away, then nodded for them to continue with the smaller ones. The humiliation hit harder than any battlefield defeat. Hoffman straightened slowly, trying to hide the sting in his pride. "He trains for this," he muttered. "We train for war." But even as he said it, the logic fell thin. War was supposed to reveal the truth about nations, and yet here he was, shown a truth he had never considered. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the yard. The officers worked with increasing frustration, each crate a reminder that strength came in many forms. Some built by hunger and hard marches, others by food, labour and stability. The British Guards supervised without mockery, offering occasional instructions, but never gloating. This, more than anything, disarmed the Germans. Arrogance would have been easier to endure. Kindness, or even indifference, was far more destabilizing. During a break, the officers were led to a water barrel. Vogel gulped down the cool liquid, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "This country," he said quietly, "is strange. So green, so confident, as if it has never imagined being conquered." Weber nodded. "Perhaps that is their strength. They grow without constant fear." Hoffman leaned against a post, watching a group of MPs in the distance practicing wrestling drills. Their movements were precise, disciplined, and powerful. "Fear sharpens men," he said. "Comfort softens them." Weber's voice dropped. "Then why do they look harder than we do?" The question lingered in the damp air, stinging sharper than the work had. As the days turned into weeks, the Germans' perceptions shifted in ways they hadn't expected. The camp life was structured, not harsh, but ordered. Work details, rest hours, educational programs, even recreational activities were provided. The officers attended occasional lectures given by British soldiers about geography, history, or agriculture. Hoffman, who had once dismissed British culture as decadent, found himself fascinated by the sheer resilience of the nation, its ability to endure through centuries of conflict while maintaining traditions. Vogel listened quietly during a session on food rationing, realizing for the first time how British households could maintain morale while German cities starved. What surprised them most, however, was the Guards' disposition. The MPs were not cruel. They were not petty. They were firm, consistent, and strangely respectful. Their confidence came not from dominance, but from knowing they didn't need to assert it. That kind of strength was unfamiliar to the officers. Strength without insecurity, power without anger. One afternoon, when the air felt thick with approaching rain, Weber walked along the fence during free time. He spotted the giant MP sitting under a tree, writing in a small notebook. It was a delicate image, out of place with the man's physique. Weber approached cautiously. "What are you writing?" he asked. The MP looked up, surprised but not offended. "A letter," he replied, "to my wife." Weber hesitated. "You have children?" The guard smiled softly. "A son. He's 3. The simplicity of the answer hit Weber unexpectedly. He had imagined these British soldiers as blunt instruments of empire. Instead, he found men with families, hopes, and lives far removed from violence. The guard closed the notebook gently and added, "I hope he grows up in a peaceful world, not like this." Weber nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "We all hoped for that," he whispered, though the irony was not lost on either of them. Later that evening, a storm swept across the camp, hammering the rooftops with heavy rain. Inside the barracks, the officers gathered around a dim lamp. The conversation was quiet, but charged with the weight of everything they had witnessed. "We misjudged them," Vogel admitted, his voice low. "All of them." Hoffman sat on his bunk, hands clasped together. "We misjudged ourselves," he said. "We were taught to measure strength only by the battlefield. But strength is also in how a nation stands when its land is defended, when its people are fed, when its children sleep without bombs overhead." Silence settled over the room, deep and reflective. No one argued. No one tried to salvage the arrogance that once shielded them. Something had shifted, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Over the next few days, the officers worked alongside other prisoners, learning tasks they never imagined performing. They repaired fences, cleaned storage rooms, helped unload supply trucks. Each task stripped away another layer of pride, revealing something raw and honest beneath. Hoffman found himself observing the British Guards with a growing respect. Not because they were giants, but because they chose restraint over dominance. Vogel became quieter, less reactive, as if rethinking every assumption he had ever held. Weber, meanwhile, wrote reflections in a small notebook of his own, unsure whether they were for himself or the world he hoped would exist after the war. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the towers and cast long shadows across the yard, the giant MP approached the officers. His steps were slow, deliberate. Hoffman straightened instinctively, unsure what to expect. The guard stopped in front of them, his expression unreadable. "There's a message from command," he said. "Your group will soon be relocated to another camp. Better facilities, more responsibilities." The officers exchanged glances, uncertain whether this was good news or another lesson wrapped in discomfort. But before they could speak, the guard added something that pierced deeper than any order. "You'll find men in there, even stronger." The words landed with quiet finality. And as the last light faded, the officers realized this journey of humility was far from over. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.